This is modern bread. It can be made in as little as 3 hours. It's packed with chemical additives, and it's engineered for a long, quiet life on a supermarket shelf. It's soft, uniform, and a miracle of industrial efficiency. And this is medieval bread, made over 24 hours from a living culture of wild yeasts and bacteria, with nothing more than flour, water, and salt. For a medieval peasant, this dense, dark, and often sour loaf wasn't a choice. It was the difference between life and death. So what did they know that we've forgotten? The secret isn't just about a tangy flavor or a rustic look. It's a lost biological technology, a sophisticated process that unlocked vital nutrients from their most essential food source. Nutrients that your modern loaf may be actively working against. You're about to see that the medieval peasant wasn't just baking. They were performing a daily act of nutritional alchemy. To understand why a medieval peasant trusted sourdough with their life, you first have to understand the world they lived in. It was a world dictated not by clocks, but by the sun, the seasons, and the relentless gnawing demands of hunger. For the vast majority of people, the serfs and laborers who made up over 90% of the population, life was a precarious balance, and the foundation of that balance was grain. Historians figure the average peasant's diet was overwhelmingly carbs. Meat was a rare luxury, saved for feast days or poached at the risk of your life. Fresh vegetables were seasonal. Dairy was valuable, but often reserved for the Lord or for making cheese. The core of their caloric intake, the very fuel that powered them through backbreaking labor from sunup to sundown, was bread. It's estimated a peasant might eat between 1 and 1.5 kilograms. That's 2 to 3 pounds of bread every single day. This wasn't a side dish. It was the meal. Everything else was just componagium, a Latin term, literally meaning that which is eaten with bread, a sliver of cheese, a few onions, a bit of salted fish. All of it was just a companion to the main event. Having bread meant having life. Being without it meant starvation. But turning grain into life wasn't simple. The peasant's life was tangled in a system of obligation, and bread was at its very center. A family grew their own grain, but they didn't own the tools to process it. For that, they had to go to the lord of the manor's mill. The miller, often a deeply mistrusted figure, would take a portion of the flour as payment a toll called the multure. This fee could be 1/16 of their precious harvest, a huge loss for a family on the edge. And the control didn't stop there. Most peasant cottages were small, single-room huts, and they weren't equipped with ovens. The risk of fire was just too great for the tightly packed wooden villages. Instead, baking was done in a communal oven, the four banal, which you guessed it was also owned by the lord. To use this oven, the peasant paid another fee, sometimes in coin, but more often with a piece of their dough or a finished loaf. The household would prepare their dough at home, carefully marking it with a family symbol so they could find it later. Then came the delicate task of carrying their risen dough to the oven, covering it with a cloth to protect it from the cold air that could ruin the whole thing. Imagine that. Your family's survival for the week depends on this one batch of bread. You've already lost flour to the miller. You're about to lose dough to the Lord. The grain you harvested might be low quality. The weather could be cold and uncooperative. Everything had to work. This wasn't artisan baking. This was a high-stakes gamble for survival. In that world, you don't use a method unless it's reliable. While unleavened flatbreads existed, to get the most volume, the longest shelf life, and the best nutrition, peasants relied on a far more ancient technology, leavening. And for most of history, right down into the Middle Ages, leavening meant sourdough. They didn't trust it because it was trendy. They trusted it because their lives depended on it. So what was this ancient technology? It was a living, breathing culture of wild yeast and bacteria, a sourdough starter. While modern baking obsesses over precise measurements and temperature-controlled proofing boxes, the medieval baker worked on pure intuition, a sensory knowledge passed down through generations. At the heart of their success was the perpetual mother. Instead of a small jar of starter, the medieval household often kept a much larger mass of fermented dough, sometimes 5 or 10 kilograms, in a cool cellar or a big ceramic crock. This wasn't separate from their bread, it was their bread. When it was time to bake, they'd take what they needed, then replenish the mother by adding back the same amount of fresh flour and water they'd removed. This method gave them two huge advantages: mass and temperature. A big vessel of dough has thermal inertia. It doesn't change temperature quickly, which created a remarkably stable environment for the microorganisms. The cool, stable temperatures of a cellar, often between 7 and 13 degrees Celsius, 45-55 degrees Kelvin, dramatically slowed the whole process down. The yeast, which makes bread rise, became less active. This wasn't a flaw, it was the entire secret. This long, slow, cold fermentation, often lasting 24 hours or more, was the engine of the whole system. While the yeast worked slowly, other crucial things were happening. Enzymes in the flour had more time to break down starches and proteins, creating a far more complex flavor. But more importantly, the bacteria, the lactobacillus species, had time to work their magic. These bacteria are what give sourdough its name. They produce acids, primarily lactic acid for a mild tang and acetic acid for a sharper, vinegary bite. This acid wasn't just for flavor, it was a critical survival mechanism. In a world without preservatives, spoilage was a constant threat. Mold could ruin a week's worth of bread, a catastrophe for a peasant family. The acids produced in sourdough fermentation acted as a powerful natural preservative, lowering the dough's pH and creating an environment hostile to mold. A proper sourdough could last for days, a crucial advantage when you only bake once a week. Medieval bakers also knew their starters were resilient. A healthy, acidic culture could resist contamination. A starter that seemed dead could often be revived with a few feedings. Some sources even describe an incredible preservation technique. A piece of starter would be mixed with a huge amount of salt, creating a stiff, salty mass that put the yeast and bacteria into hibernation. When it was time to bake again, the baker would just rinse the salt off, feed it, and within a day, the starter would be alive and ready to go. This was a robust, resilient, and deeply intelligent system. The 24-hour fermentation wasn't an inconvenience. It was a process that developed flavor, ensured a good rise, and most critically, preserved the bread. But its most profound secret was happening at a microscopic level, unlocking the very nutrition that made survival possible. And here we are, at the core revelation. The true genius of sourdough lies not just in what it adds flavor and preservation, but in what it subtracts. Every grain of wheat or rye contains a treasure trove of vital minerals: iron, zinc, magnesium, calcium. These are the micronutrients essential for energy, immune function, and bone health, all desperately needed by a body under constant physical strain. But nature put a lock on this treasure chest. Grains contain a compound called phytic acid. In the human gut, it acts as an anti-nutrient. Its structure allows it to bind tightly to those essential minerals, forming complexes our bodies can't absorb. You can eat a loaf of nutrient-rich whole grain bread, but if the phytic acid is still there, a huge portion of those minerals passes right through you. For a medieval peasant on the brink of malnutrition, this was a direct barrier to survival. This is where the magic of sourdough comes in. The long, slow fermentation is the key to that lockbox. Flour naturally contains an enzyme called phytase, but it's mostly inactive. When the sourdough starter is introduced, the lactic acid bacteria get to work, steadily lowering the pH of the dough. This acidic environment flips a switch, activating the phytase enzyme. Over the course of that long fermentation, the activated enzyme systematically breaks down the phytic acid. Studies have shown a traditional sourdough process can slash the phytic acid content of whole grain flour, with reductions often in the range of 60–80% or even more. With the phytic acid neutralized, the minerals it was holding captive are released. The iron, the zinc, the magnesium, they all become bioavailable, ready to be absorbed by the body. Suddenly, the peasant's loaf is transformed. It's no longer just calories, it's a source of life-sustaining minerals. This process effectively turned their daily bread into a natural multivitamin. They had no idea what phytic acid or phytus enzymes were, but through centuries of observation, they perfected a process that maximized the nutrition from their most precious resource. But the benefits didn't stop there. The long fermentation also pre-digested the grain. The bacteria and yeast break down not only the starches, but also some complex proteins, including gluten. While this doesn't make the bread gluten-free, it can make it much easier to digest, a crucial advantage when you're eating over a kilogram of it every day. This fermentation also creates a lower glycemic response, meaning the bread releases its sugars into the bloodstream more slowly, providing the steady, long-lasting energy needed for a day of hard labor. Now, compare that to a modern industrial loaf. Produced in a few hours, it relies on huge amounts of commercial yeast for a rapid rise. There's no time for lactic acid bacteria, no time for the pH to drop, and therefore, no time for the phytase enzyme to activate. The phytic acid remains, locking away the very minerals that make whole grains valuable. The peasant sourdough was a system that prioritized nutrition. The modern industrial loaf is a system that prioritizes profit. The medieval baker's sophistication didn't end with fermentation. It extended to the very grains they used. We often imagine the rich eating fine white bread and the poor eating coarse dark loaves, but the reality was far more clever. For many peasants, the daily loaf was made from a strategic mixture known as maslin. Maslin, from an old French word for mixture, referred to growing different grains together in the same field, and the bread made from their flours. The most common combo was wheat and rye. This started as a form of agricultural insurance. Wheat and rye have different tolerances. In a year that was bad for wheat, rye might still thrive, and vice versa. Planting them together was a hedge against total crop failure. This was a practical decision, but it had a remarkable side effect in the bakehouse. Wheat is prized for its gluten, which creates the structure for a light, chewy loaf. Rye, on the other hand, is low in gluten, but is packed with sugars and nutrients that a sourdough starter absolutely loves. When a baker mixed rye into their dough, they were adding rocket fuel to their fermentation. The rye would kickstart the process, ensuring the dough became acidic and leavened, even if the wheat was poor quality or the weather was cold. This maslin bread was the true staple of the common people. It had a darker color, a denser crumb, and a more robust earthy flavor. At the top of the social ladder was the pain de main, or manchet, the bread of lords, made from the finest, sifted white wheat flour, a symbol of wealth and purity. Below that was whole wheat for merchants, then maslin for the peasantry, and at the very bottom was bread made from barley, oats, or in times of famine, things like acorns and tree bark. But the peasant's maslin loaf represents a perfect synergy of farming pragmatism and baking science. The wheat provided structure, the rye provided fermentation power. Combined with the long sourdough process, they created a loaf that was not only reliable, but also nutritionally superior and naturally preserved. It shows, once again, that the peasants' approach to their most vital food was anything but simple. So if this method was so robust and nutritious, why did we ever abandon it? The shift away from sourdough was a slow, great forgetting, driven by technology, changing tastes, and the relentless pursuit of speed. The first major blow came during the Middle Ages. In the growing towns and cities of beer-brewing regions, a new leavening agent became available: barm. The yeasty foam skimmed from fermenting beer. For bakers, barm was a game changer. It was far more potent and faster acting than a traditional starter. A bread leavened with barm could rise in a fraction of the time, and it produced a loaf that was lighter, softer, and less sour. As urban tastes began to favor this milder flavor, sourdough started to be seen as old-fashioned and rustic. For centuries, bakers either used sourdough or sourced yeast from a local brewer, but the Industrial Revolution sped things up exponentially. In the 19th century, scientists like Louis Pasteur figured out how to isolate and produce specific strains of yeast on an industrial scale. By the late 1800s, commercial baker's yeast, a single strain perfected to produce gas as fast as possible, became widely available. It was predictable, reliable, and cheap. The era of the slow fermented loaf was drawing to a close, but the final nail in the coffin came in 1961 with the Chorleywood bread process, or CBP. This was a triumph of industrial engineering, designed to produce a standard, soft, sliced loaf in about 3 hours using cheaper, lower protein wheat. The slow, gentle work of fermentation was replaced by brute mechanical force. High-speed mixers violently developed the gluten in minutes. To make it work, a cocktail of additives is required: extra yeast, emulsifiers, and other chemicals to create that soft, uniform texture. Today, this process accounts for around 80% of bread in the UK and is used worldwide. But this efficiency came at a profound nutritional cost. The Chorleywood process is the complete antithesis of the medieval sourdough method. There's no long fermentation, no lactic acid bacteria, no breakdown of phytic acid, and no predigestion of starches and proteins. We traded a biological system perfected over thousands of years for a chemical and mechanical one designed for speed. We forgot that the time it took to make bread wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system. That slowness was what unlocked minerals, eased digestion, and preserved the loaf. In our rush to make bread faster, we engineered out the very qualities that made it the staff of life. The story of medieval bread is the story of a lost technology. It reveals a profound, intuitive understanding of biology that we're only now beginning to appreciate with modern science. The peasant with their dark, sour loaf wasn't ignorant. They were the steward of a system that maximized the health, safety, and nutritional value of their most essential food. They trusted sourdough with their lives because it worked. The long fermentation wasn't a burden. It was a biological engine that transformed simple grain into a more nourishing food. It was a natural preservative. It predigested the grain, and most critically, it dismantled the anti-nutrients in the flour, unlocking vital minerals that stood between them and malnutrition. Today, we're surrounded by bread stripped of this ancient wisdom. The modern loaf is a monument to convenience, but that convenience has a cost. In trading the patience of fermentation for the speed of machines, we've traded nutrition for efficiency. But the peasant's loaf is more than a history lesson. It's a reminder that sometimes the oldest ways are the wisest, and that how we prepare our food matters just as much as what's in it. It reminds us of something a medieval peasant understood in their bones. Real food takes time.